This is episode 387 of That Shakespeare Life.
Hi, I'm Robert Stefanik, Assistant Professor of English and Fine Arts at the U.S. Air Force Academy and author of a forthcoming book, Coriolanus and the Death of the Human. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend, Cassidy Cash.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
For Shakespeare and his contemporaries, the line between history and myth was often delightfully blurred. Legends of King Arthur and the fabled Holy Grail captured the imaginations of 16th century England, weaving their way into royal propaganda, courtly entertainments, and even the education of young scholars. Elizabeth I herself was likened to the Grail Maiden, and stories of sacred relics mingled with Renaissance curiosity and Protestant skepticism. While Shakespeare doesn't mention the Grail directly in his plays, the ideas and imagery surrounding it would have been well known to his audiences. In a world shifting from medieval tradition to early modern innovation, what did the Grail mean in Shakespeare's England? To help us explore this fascinating blend of myth, politics, and early modern belief, we're joined today by historian and author Sean Munger. Sean Munger is a historian, YouTuber, author, and teacher. He is most well known for his lengthy deep dive YouTube videos on various historical subjects. He also teaches courses on medieval and modern history, including, among others, an online class on the history and legend of the Holy Grail. His work uncovers how legends like King Arthur and the Grail were received across centuries, including during Shakespeare's lifetime. Learn more about Sean and see his history courses available right now, all in the show notes for today's episode. Before we dive into today's conversation, I want to remind you that you can follow along with this week's episode by looking at the detailed show notes. They're available at cassidycash.com/episode 387. You log in as a patron and you can view 16th and 17th century illustrations, ballads, and documents that explore Arthurian legends, the Tudor Grail connection, and Protestant attitudes towards relics. Again, find all these things right now at cassidycash.com/episode 387. And now, let's dive into the history. Hello, Sean. Welcome to That Shakespeare Life.
Hello. Glad to be here. Thank you.
What was the Holy Grail believed to be during the Renaissance? Was it a cup, a stone, or something else entirely?
Well, it's a little hard to define. And the short answer is all of those and none of them.
Just to make sure we're not complicated.
Right. Part of the difficulty, the Holy Grail is kind of a moving target. And part of the difficulty is that our conception of what it is or what it might be in the modern world is very, very different than what it was in medieval times and later than that. In the modern world, we tend to assume that it is a physical artifact, that it's something that exists in the real world, and possession of that artifact is the name of the game. And that was not the case with the Holy Grail through most of its, I don't even want to use the words existence because it doesn't really exist. And again, that in itself is kind of frustrating to modern people because we're used to thinking of these things as real. And the question being, is it real or is it not? That wasn't the question in these times. So the Holy Grail is not a biblical origin. It's not mentioned anywhere in the Bible. It is a literary phenomenon, and it first began to arise in various epic poems written in the Middle Ages. So it's not as if there was a believed to be a physical artifact that had existed since the time of Christ, and finding that or interacting with it was the name of the game. That's not really what it's about.
Nothing at all like trying to find the lost ark, for example.
Well, I mean, even that has its peculiarities as well. You know, again, we're kind of taking a modern tack on these types of things. And we live in a culture today that's much more secularist than the times of the Middle Ages or Elizabethan times. And we tend to think of things in terms of material. And part of that is just our culture, our capitalistic culture, our culture that's defined by science, by archaeology, by history, by, you go into an archive and you find a record that says this and that must prove that something in the past happened. People didn't think that way until fairly recently in history. So in the various stories about the Holy Grail, it is not always or even often portrayed as a cup or chalice. That is one interpretation. In many of the medieval stories, von Eschenbach's, for example, it's a stone or a dish of some kind that dispenses a Holy Communion wafer. A stone is very popular. There's also a minority of references to it that describe it as a book written in the blood of Christ. So the idea that it is a cup or a chalice is a fairly modern take on it and not universal.
So I guess this means that nobody in Shakespeare's lifetime was ever actually going on or claiming to go on a quest to find the Holy Grail if they didn't think it was real. Is that correct?
Well, I'm not aware of anyone in Shakespeare's time or that time going on a quest for the Holy Grail. If someone did that, it would have been somewhat anticlimactic, I think, because first of all, in the classic King Arthur texts, the Grail is said to be, mostly in Glastonbury in England. So you wouldn't have to quest very far. It's not like you have to go to the Holy Land. The idea of the Holy Grail being in the Holy Land came into our culture in 1989 with the Steven Spielberg film. So the idea, and there are also various, there are some physical objects that some have claimed are the Holy Grail. There is one in a chalice. There's a chalice in a chapel in Valencia, Spain, which has been there since, I believe, 1437. So if you wanted to go questing for the Holy Grail, you could take a junket to Valencia, Spain, and go to this chapel. And there it is. And in fact, you can see it. I teach a class, an online class on my website about the Holy Grail. And I tend to use Google Maps software a lot in my classes. And at one point in my class, I would take you into the chapel in Valencia and actually show you the object that some people claim is the Holy Grail. There's also another one in New York City, by the way, in one of the art museums. And how anticlimactic is that the final resting place of the Holy Grail is New York City?
I don't know. I think you can find everything in New York City. So
pretty much.
Why not that too? How were Arthurian legends like the Grail perceived during the Tudor period? Were they seen as this romantic myth, or were they more national heritage, or was it considered something sacred at this time?
I think it was really about identity building. Queen Elizabeth and the Tudors that preceded her were very much into the Arthur stories. And again, the Holy Grail is really sort of what we call a side quest. So it's not the central focus of these stories. In fact, in the most well-known English or proto-English version of Le Morte d'Arthur, it's kind of a side quest that appears in one of the chapters, but none of the others. So it was really the identity that was important. It was the identification with King Arthur, with the past traditions of the British kings. And particularly in the 17th century, a little bit after Shakespeare's time, there was sort of, in cultural memory, there was sort of a tug of war over the Arthurian legends that kind of tracked, at least some scholars have argued that it tracked the rise and fall of kingly power in England versus Parliament's power, where when kings were ascendant and much of the focus was on them, the idea of Arthur being real and this long tradition, unbroken or semi-broken tradition going back to modern kings is important. And then when Parliament was in ascendance, that was less popular. So it was really about national identity, which I think is the real importance of the Arthur stories more than anything else.
Well, as you're mentioning here, the Tudors did famously link their lineage to King Arthur, but how did this political connection shape how the people of Shakespeare's day would look at the Holy Grail?
That's a good question, and I'm not sure I know the answer to it. I think that a lot of this is sort of, my impression is that a lot of these founding myths and these ideas of the British past, King Arthur, and particularly the post-Roman identity of Britain, that was all kind of mixed up in a soup, I guess you'd say, in which the ordinary people were swimming. So, there there were lots of classical references and references to these kinds of medieval stories in people's education and people's daily life and things like that. To what degree they valued certain parts of it over others, I couldn't really speak to, but the fact that Elizabeth and the Tudors and James I also identification with King Arthur, we are the heirs of King Arthur. The fact that they wanted to do that, I think, proves that there was some political value and some cultural value in those ideas. So one thing that when you study history, and particularly medieval history, you get a sense very quickly of how different people thought about the world than we do today. Our world has been so transformed by the Enlightenment, by science, by rationality and things like that. And that was just not true in medieval times. So people could hold ideas that we think are irrational. They could hold ideas that were contradictory. I mean, we still do that today. So to an extent, we look back in time at what people thought about identity and national character and things like that. And the picture, I think we in the modern world are hampered by our rationalist thinking and our rationalist world, where we're unable to conceptualize a lot of how people saw the world back then. That's just been my observation.
Even if they didn't think that the Holy Grail was a real thing, obviously these stories are very present in this Shakespeare's lifetime and this time period surrounding Elizabeth I and James I. So were there popular ballads, things like chapbooks or published stories that were circulating in the 16th and 17th century that referenced the Holy Grail or its imagery? What kind of primary sources do we have about this story?
Well, there's not many primary sources because, of course, it's a kind of a literary creation. So one thing that you notice when you study the Holy Grail is that as a historian, you kind of cross an invisible line. Your sources stop being historical sources and start being literary criticism. It's a curious phenomenon when that happens. Of course, in England, probably the most famous, at least in Shakespeare's and Tudor and early Stuart times, would have been La Morte d'Arthur by Malory, which I believe was published in 1485, right when the Tudors came to power. So there's been a lot of scholarship about the authorship of that and who was Malory and how was that published and transmitted into the culture. I'm not an expert on that particular book, but I know it was circulating in England about that time. So again, would have been a divide between the kind of people who were, reading and writing in literary circles in that time, and then the common people for whom Shakespeare seems to have written a lot of his stuff. So how the stories got across that divide and what they were diluted into when they crossed that divide, I'm not really sure. But it was in the soup. Again, try to use the conception of the soup. All this stuff was sort of swimming in the soup. I think that the people of England.
That's an exceptional image because it really is a good way to think about everything that's kind of there, but not as individual as you might expect, because it is mixed up with so much else. Which brings me to a wonderance about the Protestant rejection of relics. This was, Protestant England was relatively new here, and it was a big part of rejecting Catholicism to say, that we reject things exactly like the Holy Grail. So how did people in Elizabethan England think about the Grail from a Protestant perspective? Was it something you're not supposed to talk about anymore, or did they bring it back up in a different way?
I don't think that they really envisioned the Holy Grail as a relic in the way that traditional relics in the Catholic Middle Ages were thought of. Of course, in the centuries before the Protestant Reformation, you would go on pilgrimage across Europe or to the Holy Land, and you'd visit a whole chain of cathedrals that would have we have some of the holy thorns, or we have the arm bone of John the Baptist, or, something like that. Most of these artifacts were fake because there was not only was there no authentication, but authentication wasn't really important in the way that it would be today. So I think the rejection of relics within Protestant times had probably less of an effect on the concept of the Holy Grail than you might think, because it wasn't really considered to be one of those kinds of relics. It was something in a story.
Which goes back to what you mentioned at the beginning of it was never considered an actual object for Shakespeare's lifetime. It was always an idea.
Sure. I mean, there would have been speculation, I think, about, well, could it have been real at one time, or do these stories describe, a shadow of something that really happened? Again, there's all that speculation, but, a specific physical object, again, there's a divide between that and what the Grail really was. And again, if you read the stories, particularly the medieval legends, that it's not the possession of the Grail itself that's important. The Grail is kind of a metaphor. It's a redemptive process. The traditional Grail knights, Lancelot and Bors or whatever, have to be these virtuous people in order to find it. And you can't find it if you're not virtuous, or you don't have the right belief in not just religious ideas, but also the ideas of chivalry. That was so important in the Arthur legends. So the whole thing was really much, and again, it's frustrating for modern audiences because, again, we expect, well, is it a thing or isn't it? That wasn't really the question. It's more like it's sort of a metaphor for redemption and for belief and things like that.
Well, there's obviously a lot to unpack about the Tudors and their love of King Arthur, as well as the stories of the Grail as they were circulating, not just in medieval England, but how those stories trickled into Shakespeare's lifetime. I think of things like The Fairy Queen by Edmund Spenser would be worth checking out. And then there's a whole lot of stuff to explore in the Chronicles of England, Scotland, and Ireland from Holinshed and others as well. So if we wanted to dive in here and really explore what were the narratives surrounding the Holy Grail, what was the Tudors and their love of King Arthur, from your research into this topic, where should we begin to learn more?
There was a very good book published in the 90s by Norma Lore Goodrich, which I would recommend, and I use that as a part of the basis for my online class. There's been a lot written on the Arthur legends, of course, and again, the Holy Grail is a small portion of the Arthur legends, so you can't really separate the two. So there has been a lot of scholarship on King Arthur and, the classic works that have been done on that, but the Grail, again, is kind of a moving target. So there have been some books written on it. The Goodrich book is good. I have some other sources listed in my class.
We will absolutely link to Norma's book. And then, of course, we would recommend that you check out Sean Munger's website. He has his course listed at seanmunger.com. And then there's also a video where he analyzes the film Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade. This video deals with the Holy Grail and other topics related to what we're talking about here. So I will link to that and his recommended resources in the show notes for today's episode, along with links to Edmund Spenser and Holinshed, which I think definitely belong in your study of King Arthur and the Tudors.
Absolutely.
So we will put those all in the show notes for today's episode. Stay tuned for the URL for where to find those. Sean, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible. So your choice would be in addition to those.
Oh, gosh. That's such a hard question because, I live my life around books. I would have to say probably The Winds of War by Herman Wouk, which is a wonderful novel about World War II, and I've always loved it for much of my life. Close second, I think, would be Dr. Zhivago by Boris Pasternak, which is a wonderful book. It's mostly unreadable. There's sections of it that are just absolutely magnificent, and then there's other sections that are like, what?
I'm glad somebody else feels that way about Dr. Zhivago. Yeah, it was a hard one for me.
It's really dense, but the like particularly that middle section where they're on the train is amazing. Really amazing. So
that's how I felt too. Yeah. And if you're on a deserted island, that one's definitely a good epic drama or a World War II book. Both good choices when you have some extra time on your hands.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, what's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
Oh, well, I'm always working on something. Most of my public facing history work these days is on my YouTube channel. I've been working on a video about the American Revolution era, which is almost entirely pieced together from quotes and primary source documents of the words of the people who were there, witnesses to battles and political events and things like that. I recently put out a video on the history of Mexico during World War II, which proved to be very popular because a lot of people know that Mexico was involved in World War II, but don't know very much about it. And so I kind of delve into that. And that one's been very, very popular. So I have a number of other videos in the works. I'm also write some fiction books. So if you're interested in, I've written some crime fiction and a mystery and some science fiction. You can find my books on Amazon, and I'm always working on something in that vein as well.
That all sounds like exciting stuff. And I would expect nothing less but constant busyness from a historian and an entrepreneur. Yeah. So kudos to you. Thank you. So enjoyed talking with you today, Sean, and we look forward to seeing the new things that you're working on. Thank you again for being here and introducing us to this sliver of Shakespeare's history where we can see what they thought about the Holy Grail. I appreciate you being here to share it with us.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
That wraps up our journey into the legends and realities of the Holy Grail in Shakespeare's England. A special thank you to Sean Munger for illuminating how myth, monarchy, and religion shaped the meaning of this elusive artifact during the Bard's lifetime. To learn more about Sean and explore the resources mentioned in today's show, including related episodes on Tudor identity and sacred relics, visit the show notes at cassidycash.com/episode 387. While you're there, remember to log in as a patron using any of the Access the Detailed show notes buttons you'll see there to access all the insider history extras related to this week's topic. And if you're ready to go one step further into Shakespeare's world, our Experience Shakespeare tier on Patreon gives you access to hands-on history activity kits that let you go beyond the episode to try out games, recipes, and crafts straight from the life of William Shakespeare. Just head to the show notes page, click the Access the Detailed show notes button, and select Experience Shakespeare to get started. Again, find all of these things at cassidycash.com/episode 387. That's cassidycash.com/EP387. Thank you for listening. Until next time, may your quests be noble, your stories legendary, and your relics free of imposters. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.